Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to finally drop my review of all of the champion releases that happened in 2022. It's something I do every year where I look at the champions that were either released or reworked, specifically VGU'd, in the previous year and give my impressions on either how well Riot did with the newer champion releases or how well they were able to do with the VGUs. I tend to look at this from not only a mechanical perspective but also from a balance and character design perspective, and then give my overall thoughts on each champion release. Now, obviously, 2022 had very few releases, a lot fewer than we're normally used to. Riot moved away from the 6 guaranteed champions per year to will release champions when they're ready, which means that this year, even though we should have had at least 6 new champions plus the reworked Udyr, we only had 6 in total. 5 champions plus the reworked Udyr. In addition, the 2 of the champions were holdovers from last year. They should have come out last year and they didn't. So it was a bit of a disappointing year for champion releases, especially since there's still no word on that RE ASU that was supposed to come out this year, and it's a pretty slow pace. I'm alright with new releases being delayed, but I would love to see Riot step up the VGU ASU cadence to help compensate. But either way, that's not what you guys are here for. You're here for the review, and let's start all the way back at the beginning of the year with the release of Zeri. Mechanically, Zeri treads some new and very dangerous ground with her every skill shot as an auto-attack shtick, and to be honest, I think the design suffers a little bit by being pretty forced. Zeri was designed in collaboration with the Valorant team and wanted to be a shooter-esque champion, which she accomplishes at the cost of having to jump through a lot of hoops to meet her intended gameplay. Her abilities have cooldowns, or abilities in general have cooldowns, and those cooldowns have an effective minimum, meaning that if you want to be able to right-click faster than a relevant cooldown would be, you kind of can't make that happen. Either it's you're at the minimum cooldown or you're literally auto-attacking constantly as fast as the player can hit the button, neither of which is particularly good. Every champion has to have a right-click, so how do you fix Zeri's right-click functionality? Skill shots are untargeted, meaning that she can now auto-attack targets out of line of sight or try to lead them as well. She has to be able to hit towers, minions, and wards with her skill shot as well, so how do you design around that? And to be fair, Riot found solutions for all of the problems listed above, but Zeri still ends up in a very difficult spot to balance because of how she breaks one of the fundamental rules of League of Legends champion design by having ranged skill shot auto attacks. Now, this isn't automatically a problem per se. Breaking the fundamental rules of League of Legends is something that has happened on multiple other champions. Ivern, for example, literally can't damage non-epic jungle monsters. But it does mean that if you're going to break one of these rules, you have to find a way to make it feel relatively balanced. And even Ivern has gone through some balance roller coaster work, and he's mostly ended up in a good spot now. Zeri, though, has had similar, and I'm honestly not sure how Riot are going to fix her kit in a way that will make her not only feel fair to play, but also that accommodates for the fact that she has just a very, very powerful ability. And I've covered this more in depth in a previous video, which I will have linked down in the description, but suffice to say, Zeri's kit has a lot of design hurdles that I think Riot are still trying to work through. I do like the rest of Zeri's kit. It has a lot of interesting ideas. I really like the ult shock lasers fire through terrain mechanic, and Zeri having this insane mobility that doesn't actually involve dashes. It's just like all stacking movement speed bonuses with both Lightning Crash and her passive. I think that there's some really cool things that Zeri's kit does, but her defining feature, her skill shot auto attack, pulls a lot of focus from these other aspects and ultimately means that Zeri has to be balanced around that aspect rather than these other sort of fun abilities that she has at her disposal. And I've kind of alluded to this already, but balance-wise, Zeri's been on a roller coaster ever since launch. She's either been unplayably bad or overpowered, alternating from patch to patch, too strong, too weak, too strong, too weak. And this is unlikely to change unless Riot dramatically reworks Zeri, or unless she joins Azir, Ryze, and Kalista in the balance for pro play only camp, which is really disappointing because I know a lot of players were really excited about Zeri. I have a friend who really, really loved Zeri, who played Zeri a ton when she first came out, and who eventually gave up on the pick because the champion kept changing, right? The champion kept ping-ponging wildly back and forth in terms of playability, and has eventually been nerfed repeatedly for the sins of pro play, and as a result, he just doesn't play Zeri anymore, which is one of the flaws of Riot not having good champion balance. From a character standpoint as well, Zeri was a disappointment for me. She doesn't change our understanding of Runeterra or offer new insights into her home region. She's just kind of there. And even within that, Zeri's shtick has already been done on Echo, right? Where it's a teen from Zaun who has great potential and who decides to use it to protect the fellow inhabitants of their city against not only the predations from their local bullies, but also from those of Piltover, right? The upper city, which they also don't like. In Echo's case, he invented the Z-Drive with his smarts. In Zeri's case, she's magical, which is not very common for Zonites in general. But either way, it's functionally the exact same story twice. Nothing is unique about Zeri from a character standpoint or a storytelling standpoint. She's just another Echo, which is just a tremendous disappointment. And again, she doesn't teach us anything new about Zon. She's just there, a member of the community. And the reason this is a disappointment is because it means that Zeri doesn't have a way of actually featuring in any major story arcs set in the world as a whole, right? Zeri will only be participating in anything specifically located in Zon or Piltover, and even Piltover I think is a bit of a stretch, and as a result, therefore, she's probably just going to be joining the bin of characters that Riot never do anything with because they're not extremely relevant to the overall story arcs of League of Legends. And I would maybe be less critical on this point if Riot still wrote stories, but 2022 has been terrible for story content outside of Champion releases, so I think that's one of the reasons why I'm even harsher on Zeri for not having an actual story relevance. Ultimately, therefore, I think Zeri's a bit of a letdown from every perspective. Her design has issues, her story is lacking, and her balance problems have left even her diehard fans unable to enjoy her. I really think Zeri had a lot of potential that Riot eventually whiffed on, and I'm interested to see how they continue to work on Zeri moving forwards. Our second champion release of this year was, of course, Renata Glasc, and I think that Renata Glasc succeeded in a lot of ways that I don't think players realistically expected her to, but I think that ultimately she ends up being a very interesting character and does a lot more for me now than when she first came out. I think I was a little underwhelmed by her when she first was released, but now I'm actually quite on board with what she's trying to do. Mechanically, she's an interesting take on traditional enchanters. She's not content to just sit back behind her AD carry and let them do all the fighting, but she can instead sort of make plays happen on her own without just being a heal or shield bot. She has the way of doing using Handshake to set up CC combo trains, especially by grabbing a target and then being allowed to choose, do I want to pull them forward, do I want to push them away, do I want to throw them into a nearby ally for a stun for more crowd control. There's a lot of things she can do in that regard. She can have good timing on bailout in order to help revive her allies and keep them safe, in turn what should have been trade kills into just straight up 2 for 1, or 1 for nothing in Renata Glasc's favor. And of course, she has Hostile Takeover in order to lead to some big AoE wombo combo type playstyles. Despite players having some aspects with issues with aspects of Renata's kit, most notably the W revive and her ultimate, she's hardly been a problem basically at all throughout the entirety of her balance. The W revive is very difficult to actually pull off, and if you're saving it to time it and save an ally, then you're not using it for the steroid, which is quite powerful. And Hostile Takeover in some situations is worse than a stun, right? Because enemy champions will keep moving. And they may move in unexpected ways, right? You hit them with the ultimate and you expect, okay, yeah, they're going to run at each other, and then one of them runs at you. And it's sort of like, well, that's not really what I wanted out of this. But it is one of the aspects of the ability that makes it a little interesting and not necessarily super, super powerful despite its very wide AoE and its very long range. This does mean that Renata doesn't necessarily jive super well with players that like traditional supports, thanks to the unreliability of her E shielding and the need for timing on the W, but I think she ends up standing out from the crowd of other enchanters as a result of this. I think the one critique I can kind of leverage at her kit is that it's generally pretty boring and has few internal synergies outside of the E slow into Q combo, and so despite Renata Glasc being quite powerful, she's just a little bit boring. Leverage is a good example of an ability that's numerically powerful but not super interesting to use, and which has generally been more powerful in the hands of pro players than in the hands of casual players who may or may not understand what Renata Glasc is trying to get them to do. Balance-wise, to kind of touch on pro play, Renata's been pretty fair. She's had a couple of tweaks, I believe, but she hasn't really been pick or ban until the last few weeks at Worlds, and even then, that's in the context of the Worlds metagame, not necessarily her overall balance state. Professional teams are the ones saying, hey, Renata Glasc has a ton of tools that we really like, and we're prioritizing her, or we're prioritizing her for a ban because we know the enemy team is going to make use of her, and so that's different from the overall balance state of the champion. I think that Renata Glasc has actually been in a very good balance state basically since she came out, so even if she's a little boring, I think that she has enough playmaking inherent in her kit that she still retains some interest, and certainly hasn't been a problematic champion from a balance standpoint. Character-wise, Renata Glasc is supposed to be the big bad of Zon, which is a title that feels completely unearned, especially because she's supposed to be this character that's all, it was always me, behind the scenes, and you just never knew it until now, but the problem is she didn't exist until she was released, right? Riot didn't hint at her in stories years prior to her release, or even a couple of months prior to her release, with basically one-off mentions of, oh yeah, Glasc Industries was behind this, or this character is related to Glasc Industries and did something, or this product malfunctioned or had like a device in it that was problematic for me, and it was created by Glasc Industries, so was it created with them, by them, or was it added after it was bought, right? There was none of that setup. Right, basically just said, oh yeah, actually Renata Glasc is the biggest bad of Zaun. And it's just completely unearned, especially when you consider that Zaun has had plenty of characters who could have stepped into that role. Urgot, Singed, even Victor, given the right motivation. They all could have been the big bad of Zaun, but instead it's this character that just came out this year and that we're just supposed to immediately say, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, she's definitely the biggest, baddest person in Zaun. And I think her plan is also not written very well. Again, she came out of nowhere, and we just have to believe that she's gotten everything set up already for her to dominate Piltover, irrespective of the actions of any of the other characters that might have been able to catch her in advance. For example, Caitlyn is an extremely good detective. How come Caitlyn didn't pick up on any of this in advance? Again, the answer here, of course, is that Renata Glasc didn't exist until she came out, but it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth when I consider that Renata Glasc is supposed to be this badass Chem Baron of Zaun, who's the biggest, baddest person in the city, and it just doesn't feel earned to me at all. That said, I think that Riot have made Renata's character very interesting. I love her being ostensibly charitable and one of the community and helping the people in need, but then always having little strings attached to the aid she offers, so she's always able to call upon a favor or two or three in order to get what she wants after the fact, which is just really, really cool. And I love that she's also a literal interpretation of that Gaslight Gatekeep Girl Boss meme, though maybe we should change it to Gas Gatekeep Girl Boss. That might be more fitting, but either way, I think there are some interesting things that she's done character-wise, and fundamentally, I don't necessarily have a problem with her as the big bad of Zaun. I just feel like, again, she just got awarded that position as opposed to stepping into it. Ultimately, I think Renata Glasc works out well enough. She's not particularly intriguing from a mechanical perspective, but she has enough unique traits that she still ends up standing out from the crowd, especially from other enchanters. And I think her status as the big bad of Zaun at least tells us something about the state of Runeterra and makes her a character to pay attention to, who we know is going to come up in future stories, unlike Miss Zeri. I think Renata is solidly mid-tier, but after the sort of disappointment that was Zeri, I think that we could definitely have used that from a character like Renata Glasc. Our third champion released this year was, of course, Belveth, and you already all know my opinions on Belveth if you've even remotely been watching the channel, especially when Belveth was first announced and when she eventually came out. I think, mechanically, Belveth is terrible. She is a stat-stick champion whose design is even worse than Master Yi's, who's the champion she's supposed to be similar to. She has dashes, a skill shot, and channeled ability, but despite it all, the one thing Belveth wants to do is right-click champions, which is her entire damage output, which therefore gives her a lot less counterplay and interactivity than I would have liked. Belveth doesn't do anything other than dash at you and right-click you. There's really not that much else going on with her. Despite having all these other tools in her kit, you can kind of ignore them because of the right-click shtick. She has this infinite attack speed mechanic, which is cool on paper, but in practice is worthless. You can also look at the 5 attacks a second Kog'Maw build that Riot had a while back. The only way in which that was relevant is when Kog'Maw stood completely still and just had the raw stats to kill everyone around him, and that's the exact same position that Belveth is in. Even though she can stack attack speed infinitely, it ends up with the exact same gameplay as Kog'Maw without the ability or the advantage of being ranged and therefore having to move less. Her ultimate is entirely a passive effect. There's no reason Riot couldn't have coded it to work like Viego passive, except for the fact that they wanted to avoid champions never having to press their R key. That's literally the only reason it is not entirely a passive effect, which just adds on to the stat stick mechanics of Bel'Veth. Her whole shtick is I walk at you and I right click you and I have better stats than you, I win, and there's basically nothing else that you can do to outplay me. The Remora effect on her R is just laughable. She has an entire mechanic that is only accessible if she kills a Herald or Baron and survives, and then consumes the Void Coral, and then is able to go into a side lane and actually kill minions. Like, it just, you never get to use this mechanic at all, even if you play Bel'Veth, and it doesn't really even give her a niche because of how infrequently Barons and Rift Heralds are taken in casual games. It just doesn't make any sense for Riot to have this randomly arbitrary, oh yeah, she's better now because she got this special Void Coral that looks identical to all other Void Coral, and you're just supposed to know this as a counterplay component. No, it doesn't make any sense on the kit. I don't know why it's there, and I think it's terrible from a counterplay standpoint. Bel'Veth can't even be built in the way Riot intended for her to be built. Her ability to gap close, despite having a million dashes, is laughably bad, and she doesn't have the durability to survive in fights long enough to use that infinite attack speed. By the time she finally dashes in, she's already taken a ton of damage, she has to pop E immediately, and then maybe if she's lucky, she'll be able to get a couple of auto attacks off, all doing reduced damage because of the need to compensate for the fact that she gets infinite attack speed before she's immediately dashing or flashing her way back out of the fight because she can't stay in it long enough to actually make use of that infinite attack speed. When your on-hit skirmisher champion has to build a Frostfire Gauntlet or Sunfire Aegis to survive in teamfights, those are actually her most common mythic items right now. Like, that's how you know you've messed up this champion design. Balance-wise, Bel'Veth has been a pub stomper for the most part. She thrives at lower levels where she can exploit less skilled players to farm up, get strong, and then 1v1 opponents because all she has to do is right-click you and you can't outplay auto attacks, so she just ends up in the spot where there's nothing you can do about her. You either run away from her or run at her, and then there's just no ability or way or decision-making behind like, yeah, I can outplay this guy because it's Bel'Veth. There is no outplaying to be had. It's all right-clicks. Her playability at Worlds was actually quite surprising to me, but she only managed a 17% win rate over like 6 games, so it's not like the pick actually did anything. She showed up, she was banned in a couple of games, she was picked in a couple of games, and she lost all but one of the games she was actually played in. Far from like an actually good pick, and in all honesty, I think any team that was playing her probably was coping quite a bit. And it's my honest opinion that Bel'Veth, as with champions like Aaron, will be unbalanceable for pro play, because if she's playable professionally, she'll be like a 60% win rate monstrosity in silver and below. And if she's balanced for lower tiers, she'll be too weak to compete at the pro level, and it's because her kit has just so few points of counterplay, right? Again, this is not the kind of champion that you can outplay or who can outplay you. This is the kind of champion that outstats you, that says, I am numerically better than you, and therefore I win any interaction that we have, so you have to run away from me. Right? Or I am numerically inferior to you and I will never fight you because I can't. There's no way for me to actually outplay you. Which is just, it's just a letdown overall. That said, I think that character-wise, Bel'Veth is phenomenally interesting. I think she's the first champion of the year that I was really engaged with from a lore perspective. I was initially really concerned with Bel'Veth, that Bel'Veth was going to ruin the Eldritch, unknowable hive mind aesthetic of the Void, because she's supposed to be this Void Empress. But Riot, I think, found a very good way to balance it out by saying that Runeterra bleeded into the Void just as the Void bled into Runeterra, and therefore Runeterra's individuality was something that the Void had to reckon with and deal with. And eventually the Void dealt with it by saying, we have to have a leader. Someone has to be in charge of us, and that creation was Bel'Veth. But also having the dichotomy of Bel'Veth versus the Watchers lets Riot have their cake and eat it too, because the Void can then have a ruler, but also still have its sort of Eldritch, unknowable, we are Legion, we are Death kind of aesthetic that it has going on. And the idea that these two factions, right, Bel'Veth's Voidborn and the Watchers, are at odds with each other is super interesting, right? Bel'Veth wants Runeterra to be like the Void, which is not good for Runeterrans, but the Watchers just want it completely obliterated, which therefore means that Bel'Veth is like, hey Runeterrans, you don't like me, and I know this, but also you have to help me, because if the Watchers wake up, we're all doomed. Which just leads to a really interesting idea behind all of our Void-related characters and having to decide if working with Bel'Veth is worth it, or if they even need Bel'Veth and they can kill her and then deal with the Watchers on their own, right? And even Bel'Veth's character, I love that she just doesn't, she's not scheming, she's not lying, she's just like upfront tells you exactly what she wants from you. She's saying, I will spare you. I don't know for how long, but I will give you some degree of time and maybe you'll find a way to kill me. That degree of characterization is just so refreshing, especially on a super cool monster champion like Bel'Veth, and I just think that's really, really awesome. The Leviathan form is also really sick. I like that she tries to appear human, but has a more monstrous angle, and that's like how she always looks, but she just tries to dress up as human when she's trying to interact with these other characters. And like, ultimately, I think that Bel'Veth is a mechanical letdown in every single way, but she manages to be an extremely interesting character that hints at future storytelling by Riot. So even though she may not have a lot of stories told specifically about her, her appearance in general in the lore will inform the future of the Void storyline, and she's sort of the omnipresent threat hanging over any story that's now told about the Void, which I think is really, really cool. So I absolutely love Bel'Veth from a character perspective, but mechanically, just terrible. Our fourth champion of the year was Nilah, and I think Nilah is... she's very similar to some of the other characters released previously on this list, and I'll kind of explain what I mean as I go. Mechanically, I think Nilah is extremely safe. Riot basically said, how can we make Yasuo 3.0, and designed a character to match exactly that. Even if you look at the way in which her kit is structured, she almost has the exact same build as Yasuo, right? Which is a skillshot auto attack, a defensive ability, a mobility ability, and a wombo combo ultimate ability, right? Everything she does is like near identical to Yasuo, and she's also still having dependence on crit. This is a little bit less of a sticking point for me personally, because I think it helps cement her bot lane intended role as opposed to being a solo lane champion, but everything else about her kit feels like it was handpicked by Riot to say, how can we do Yasuo, but also not let the players know we're doing Yasuo again. So even though she was intended to be this non-traditional bot laner, she just feels like Yasuo, who admittedly is like a non-traditional bot laner, but it doesn't feel very creative when Riot said, yeah, the only way we know how to do non-traditional bot laners is by making Yasuo but again, as opposed to trying to go for something I think more interesting, like trying to make a Ziggs 2.0, who's a mage who has a lot of interactions with objectives and with towers and with minion waves. They just said, just make Yasuo again. And again, I think Riot could have gotten really creative with her, which maybe is unfair for me to say. Melee champions have historically not really been playable bot lane, so Riot wanted to make sure she had the tools to be playable there without also making her too strong, while also trying to keep her out of solo lanes, so maybe their hands were just kind of tied with their creativity, being able to say, we know what works, and it's Yasuo, so why would we try to reinvent the wheel here, especially when we're not trying to put out a non-traditional bot laner, say this champion plays bot lane, and then have the champion just run roughshod over bot lane, right? Or not be playable in bot lane. That would feel really, really bad. So maybe that was the intention behind a lot of the design decisions they made, but either way, it's a little disappointing for me. She does at least stand out a little bit by being somewhat supportive. Nilah helps her fellow bot laner almost as much as they help her, unlike Yasuo, who just sort of takes what he wants from his bot laner. Nilah kind of says, hey, support, you shield me, I shield you. You heal me, I heal you, and vice versa. And therefore, we kind of sort of protect each other and help each other and can contribute to each other's well-being while we're in the same lane, which gives her a little bit of a niche over Yasuo, but functionally, she's still kind of the same. I think her passive is kind of crazy. I like her ability to have big teamfight swinging plays with Apotheosis, and I think that ultimately her double XP passive, even though people were really worried about it, myself included, hasn't ended up being a big problem because she's more of a scaling pick, but ultimately I think the rest of her kit just is not that interesting overall. Balance-wise, I think Nilah's been fine, playable even at the pro level, but without being overbearing, which is like the perfect level. If your champion can be picked professionally, but isn't picked in like every game it's available, or even banned in every game it's available, like that's the perfect place for a champion to reside, and that's exactly where Nilah has been. As I talked about the double XP, she's not Mordekaiser, so she's not going to be dominating the lane with her boosted XP. She just uses it to scale a little bit better and get slightly better stats to help her survive in a lane traditionally dominated by ranged champions. And honestly, if anything, Nilah looks kind of bad competitively. She can't DPS safely from range, so she basically just has to look for an opportunity to dash in and ult multiple enemies, which then means that she's not that interesting because like her one reason to exist is as a combo piece for everybody else. Even once she does get the pullback with Apotheosis, she probably dies immediately afterwards and doesn't actually get an opportunity to DPS, so it's sort of like, why do you exist? Why are you here? What are you doing professionally? The answer is not that much, and so even though she's playable pro, I don't think she's that good, and I would expect her to fall out of the pro play meta over time. She's also very rarely seen in casual play, at least at my MMR, which I think makes sense, because as a melee bot laner, she's an acquired taste, but I think that this is a good sign because, again, if she was busted, she'd be seen way more often. As a character, I think Nilah really surprised me. I was expecting not much of anything. I was expecting another Zeri, to be completely honest, when I saw Nilah in the original trailer, but I think she's given us a ton of information about Runeterra and has progressed a ton of previous story points as well. Nilah alone has confirmed that Fiddlesticks' mysterious rhyme, talking about the first of 10, is referring to 10 major demons that are imprisoned across Runeterra, and the one of them, Ashlesh, the demon of joy, is the one that has possessed Nilah, corrupted Nilah. I'm not quite sure on the terminology there, but either way, Ashlesh is one of these demons and is the reason why Nilah can only feel joy, which is also kind of an interesting shtick for a character. To only ever be able to feel happy no matter what's happening, that's kind of a unique take on a character. It also shows us that demons don't have to prey on negative emotions. Ashlesh is a demon of joy. And it also gives context for the distant continent that Camivore is located in, as well as a new unmapped country, which is where she's from. And she also confirmed for us that Viego isn't fridged forever, which is kind of scary to think that the Ruined King may eventually come back into the lore. And so I think that Nilah has a lot of really cool things that are going on with her character, and I get the sense that she is absolutely going to be a major player in future storylines, especially in Ruination 2, Electric Boogaloo, right, when Viego wakes up. Like, absolutely Nilah will show up in that story arc. And so ultimately, I feel like Nilah is like Belveth. She's mechanically pretty mediocre, but at least interesting in some aspects, but mostly interesting from a character perspective. I really do like that about her, and I think that she at least has some opportunity for outplays, unlike Belveth. I'm very excited to see more of her in the future in terms of lore, though admittedly I don't really care for her in-game, and I think that's a little bit disappointing. Next up, I wanted to talk about the Udyr VGU, as this was technically our 5th champion release this year. Now, this was our first VGU in ages. It's been over a year since the Dr. Mundo VGU, and I was very excited to finally get our hands on this. I know why it took so long, but it's just been so long, and I really, really love VGUs in general for what they do to the characters that they're improving upon. Mechanically, Udyr's VGU has done exactly what I wanted Riot to do, which is to give each of his stances a reason to exist while keeping him as a simple, auto-attack focused champion. The addition of a slow to Udyr's R has done wonders for the champion, allowing him to stick to targets he's able to reach, as well as giving him a reliable source of damage / wave clear without needing to rely on the steroid that he previously had attached to his old Tiger stance. The super stances that Udyr has give him a good degree of flexibility as well as high moments. You can pop Super E to blank out crowd control or use a Super Q to eviscerate an isolated target. Those are both excellent moments for a champion that normally doesn't get to do things like that, right? That doesn't have one of those big pop-off moments. Now you kind of get a little bit of that power that all of us ultimate using champions are able to access. I am a little sad that Udyr lost his actual stances. He no longer has passive benefits for remaining in a stance anymore. Technically, his new bear stance, Blazing Stampede, there is a stun attached to that, and that's sort of a passive component. As long as he's in the stance, he has these stunning auto attacks, but because there's a per target cooldown, it doesn't really feel like it, so it is a little bit disappointing that the stance champion doesn't have stances, but I think each of his new abilities are more powerful on activation, and it makes him more incentivized to stance, and use all of his stances a lot more than previously, where you'd go to whichever stance you needed at the time. Now Udyr really wants to be dancing because not only is there not much of an opportunity cost, or there's not much of a reason to stick in the same stance, instead you want to swap because that way you can refresh going back into the other one and get the benefits again if you really want to. It is still a little sad as well that Udyr still feels like he has a useless stance even post-rework. His Q in this case has really dropped off in terms of contention. Wild and Claw is a 1-point wonder for basically everyone playing Udyr, and his R is the new hotness, which is funny because I believe it was the opposite way around prior to the VGU. And I think it's hard to say, Udyr players, you have to use all 4 of your abilities equally. One of them is always going to be the odd man out, but as long as there's a reason for that ability to still be taken, I think Udyr's going to be in a fine spot. And again, I like all of the other changes that Riot made mechanically to Udyr's kit. Balance-wise, Udyr's been a bit rocky. As I kind of alluded to before, Riot's had some difficulties making Udyr players use all of his abilities, in part due to how much more powerful his R has gotten. Giving a champion a slow that he can use multiple times in a row because of the super stance activation to just give him tremendous amount of staying power is really powerful, as it turns out, and that's why Udyr has been a little hard to balance, especially because of Wingborn Storm. It just does end up being in a situation where he's needed some taps down or some rebalancing on his stances to get him to a space where all of the stances are usable and none of them are overpowered, but there are still stances that stand out in comparison to others. We've yet to see Udyr in the hands of pro players that might be able to break him, but so far it seems like he's been reasonably balanced outside of some sort of outliers with people I know building Demonic Embrace on Udyr and being able to do just a ton of damage over time. Feels like he's in a better spot, but the pro players will be the ones to show us if new Udyr is truly broken or if he's actually fine, as we're kind of assuming. Character-wise, of course, this is a VGU, so Udyr hasn't changed that much. Instead, we've just gained more details about his journey from this sort of man tormented by the animal spirits into having a degree of control over them and sort of deciding what he wants to be using them for. This is a continuation from his Legends of Runeterra appearance, which I think is quite nice, and I think the coolest part of this character is the change to his Spirit Guard ultimate skin, showing an alternate timeline Udyr where he remains in Ionia, and that's a really, really cool approach to the skin, and sort of points out and says, hey, there's lore implications behind this, right? If Udyr had stayed in Ionia, this is what we would have gotten, and I think it's a cool little nod, especially because it's got all of his original stances as well. I just really, really think that's a cool thematic thing for Riot to have done for that skin. But again, the character stayed basically the same. I think the most disappointing part of the Udyr VGU is just how boring his default skin is. I really think the antlers that Riot talked about giving him would have helped him stand out and look less like just a guy. Without a stance on, Udyr is just a big mountain man type dude. There's nothing to indicate that he is Udyr, the League of Legends champion. It's really the stances that help play that up, and I think the antlers would have helped tie it together, but that's sort of neither here nor there. Generally speaking, I think that Riot have done an excellent job with Udyr's VGU. I think it was masterfully handled in terms of the design, and a perfect update for one of the most venerable champions in the game, my few quibbles notwithstanding. Finally, I wanted to talk about our most recent release, Ksante. Now, obviously, Ksante has not been out for nearly as long as the other champions, so I have a little bit less of a handle on exactly Ksante's design and a lot of what's going on with Ksante, but so that means my opinions here are going to be more subject to change, especially in terms of balance. He's another champion that we have yet to see in the hands of pro players, but I believe that mechanically Ksante is exactly what tank players have been looking for. A high skill ceiling tank that can outplay opponents and be outplayed in turn, as opposed to older champions like Malphite or Amumu. I think Riot found an extremely creative way to give Ksante kill threat without simply turbocharging his damage output like they've done for Ornn. They sort of let him freely choose to trade his durability for damage. That's super cool, and it gives him some pretty hype moments that other tanks really don't get outside of just like, I crowd controlled their entire team, and then we still lost because I'm a tank, and that's what happens to tanks. Ksante, conversely, doesn't have that I crowd controlled the entire team moment, but he does get the opportunity to say, hey, this one specific important enemy team member I am going to take out of the fight, I'm going to access my damage potential, and I'm just going to straight up kill them, and that is my contribution to the team. I think that giving him a Yasuo-esque Q was a brilliant idea. I think the gameplay is quite solid, and it gives him better in-fight damage than the ambient AoE magic damage that tanks of old have, especially due to the way in which his passive works. His passive initially reads kind of crazy, but realistically, the only thing he's ever using to proc it with is his Q, constantly pressing it off cooldown. So I fundamentally don't see too much of a problem with that ability as a whole. And I think Ksante has just a lot of flexible tools that give him multiple different ways of approaching engagements, whether it's dashing around with his E, or looking to set up a shockwave pullback with his Q, or riposting enemy CC with his W before dashing back onto them, or maybe away from them. There's just so much that Ksante's kit enables that I just really, really love how Riot have designed him. And again, this is a tank, and I think they've done an excellent job. And even Riot found a way to address like the tank that builds full damage, because Ksante can't build damage, because if he builds damage, he's not getting any damage when he presses his R, right? That's sort of how the champion is designed. I think it's just like a really, really cool way for Riot to have designed the champion overall. Balance-wise, Ksante so far hasn't seen any changes. No news is good news, in my opinion, though of course Riot have been a lot better recently about not nerfing the champion within like a month of their release, so generally I'm inclined to believe that Ksante is probably in a good spot. My personal opinion is that he's slightly weak, if anything, but generally I think he's released almost exactly where he needed to be, which is very, very nice. Character-wise, Ksante is much like Zeri. Riot did a good job of conveying Ksante's story, but it's hard to see where they intend to take the character in the future. His whole story of overcoming his pride and losing his partner is exceptionally well done, but it feels like Ksante's story is like already over as a result, right? Like, we've already seen what this guy's story is, so what are Riot going to do with him from there? And the answer is, we don't really know. There's nothing obvious where they can throw Ksante in, unlike Nilah, where we know if Viego wakes up again, Nilah will get involved. We know that Nilah already has this shtick of being involved with demons, so if Fiddlestick starts making plays, or if Nocturne is retconned to be a big major demon and has a story moment, then Nilah, of course, will be there, right? Renata Glasc, any major story that has to do with Piltover and Zon, she'll be involved. Belveth, any story involved with the Void, Belveth's presence at least will be looming over it. Ksante, though, is just, again, he's just kind of a guy in a place who doesn't do anything for the story. He does let us know that Nazuma exists and is opposed to Udyr, like every other Shuriman we've ever met, and it doesn't really provide us with any degree of story hooks outside of the maybe plot point that Zeri is creating Bakai to use as weapons, which just means that, again, alongside Zeri, Ksante is going to end up in this bin of champions that Riot released and then promptly forgot about. That they said, there's nothing we can do with you from a story perspective, so we're just going to not do anything with you from here on out. You exist, and that's great. Now get out of our sight, please, is kind of how it feels like Riot have treated champions like Ksante and Zeri, which is really disappointing because I do quite like him. Because I think as a character, he's very cool, but he just isn't going to do that much for the overarching plot. Ultimately, though, I think he's a really uniquely designed mechanical champion with a ton of room for skill expression and mastery, whose character is ultimately doomed to the scrap heap of champs that Riot chooses to do nothing with. And that is it. Those are all the champions that were released in this year. I hope you guys enjoyed the breakdown. Go ahead and let me know what your thoughts for any of these champions are down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinions. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.